All right, well, welcome, ACSA family and friends, to our first Site Leader webinar. Really excited for this opportunity to connect with and provide resources for amazingly important leaders in the state of California, site leaders. Before I get to my gratitude for you, let me thank the staff here at ACSA, Laura, Josh, Christy, Yvonne, and others who are putting this together. What a great idea. And what a necessary offering right now. So to my team, I'm proud to serve with you every day. Thanks for your insight here. We're going to get to our partners in a minute at F3, but Gretchen and Lisa, grateful for them as well. But to all of you out in the field, I can't tell you how important your role is right now. We say leadership matters at ACSA, and I would offer that leadership in a crisis matters more than ever. These are unprecedented times, and leadership is uncommonly necessary, especially at the site level. Because how do we define site these days? Are we talking about these old nuanced buildings that we used to go to, that we hope to go to someday soon when it's safe? Is it this virtual environment that we're trying to monitor? It certainly is about those connections that you folks lead with your communities, with your students, and with the adults that serve those students. And however that site is defined, virtual, in person, etc., your leadership is so very, very important. And these are challenging, difficult times to navigate. We're here to support you. We not only admire you, but we're inspired by you. And so with that, let me also invite you, tell a friend, tell a colleague, a site leader. We're going to be doing these regularly. If privacy and liability and confidentiality weren't sexy enough topics for you, I think they're really, really interesting myself and important to navigate for lots of reasons. But we'll be doing other things, social emotional learning, distance learning, etc. So tell a friend, invite an ACSA colleague or someone that hasn't heard of ACSA. In any event, let me pass the baton to one of my staff members. As I mentioned, Laura Preston is just always thinking about how she and we can better serve our members. And this is just another example of that. So Laura, I'll pass it to you, and thank you. Thank you, Christy, Josh, and Yvonne as well for putting this together.
Oh, thank you, Wes. Welcome, everyone. We're really excited about this new series. We want to be able to be a resource for all of you at the site, and recognizing that your world has changed dramatically. As we, the classroom is no longer just brick and mortar, it's now in people's homes. And we've been hearing, and I'm sure many of you have been experiencing, some of the challenges that go along with working in this digital world. And the confidentiality of many of these issues, and really it all lands on your lap because it's all initially, and so we really want to make sure that we are a resource for you. So today, before I introduce our panelists, I just want to take care of a couple of housekeeping things. We have our chat box open. Please, during the course of our presentation, feel free to put down any ideas for future webinars that we're going to be having. We have some already set in motion, but we really want to make sure we're addressing the needs that you have while you're navigating those most unusual times in all of our lives. And the other, we're going to have our Q&A box open so you can ask questions. We're going to try to answer as many questions as we can during this webinar. If we can't answer everything, then we will find the answers to you, respond to them, and put them on our site for this webinar series. I think that site link will be put up in a little bit, but you have both of those resources available to you. So we're going to try to navigate this and answer as much as we can. But again, it's my honor to be able to welcome Gretchen Shipley and Lisa Mori, both partners with the law firm of Fagen, Friedman, and Fulfrost, also known as F3. Gretchen is known nationally as one of the top attorneys on privacy. Lisa is a top attorney on labor issues, as well as navigating all of these, the various worlds that we're all living in. So I want to thank them for being here. I'm going to pass it off now to Gretchen.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Wes, and everybody at ACSA. We're thrilled to be here, and I know I speak for my colleague Lisa as well. We're really excited to speak directly to site administrators. For those of you who don't know, most school districts work with legal counsel. We're usually working with the superintendents or the board or the assistant supes, and there's a lot of challenging issues to navigate right now. And we want to be here and be a resource for ACSA and be a resource for all of you and help you answer those questions on how to address some of these tricky subjects that are really brand new in the law and brand new for school administrators. So as Laura mentioned, we'd love for you to ask whatever questions you may have in the chat, but Lisa and I will get started with, you know, in the past 6 months now, we get some of the same questions repeatedly. And as Laura mentioned, Lisa and I both work for an education law firm. So we just represent school districts, and my background is primarily focused on the education technology side and privacy. And Lisa does labor negotiations and labor and employment law. You wouldn't believe how much they intersect these days. So it'll be great to have both our perspectives on these issues. But some of the issues that we've been asked about primarily are things like, when can these online classes be recorded, either by a teacher, by a parent, by a student? When can students opt out of having their image on a camera? What about your teachers who may want to be downloading their own apps and software, and what's your responsibility around that? There's lots of issues that have come up around reporting abuse and neglect in the home. For the first time, we have a real firsthand window into students' homes. And what happens when you have a positive COVID test? It's inevitable that this is probably going to happen for many of you. You have a positive COVID case on campus, and you get a flood of phone calls from parents and a pure panic demanding to know who it was so they can decide if their kid's been exposed, and what your obligation is as far as keeping someone's medical information confidential, how you address that in a responsible way. So we're happy to talk about that as well. Those are kind of like the 5 key areas that we were going to focus on today. But again, Lisa and I have seen it all, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. Lisa, any other introductory comments you want to jump in with before we get started? I think you're on.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself for a second there. No, I think that just from my perspective, I've been at the table doing negotiations related to not only distance learning, but also now, you know, hybrid, and as districts are moving back into, at least in those purple tier counties, are moving into hybrid in-person teaching and learning, as well as under the small cohort guidance. All of the additional issues that come up around, you know, privacy and liability in terms of all the flooding of information that's going to be in your lap, whether that's related to health screening, whether it's active or passive, you know, who's doing what, who's got what information, and what the responsibilities are for maintaining a lot of that information as confidential, and what are the potential liabilities for not maintaining that information as confidentially as it's required to be under the law. So not only does it impact adults, whether that's staff and visitors and parents, but also students. So the crossover amongst, you know, every aspect is real. Some items are differently treated depending on whether it's adults or students. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of these questions for you and address some of the interesting nuances that pop up, especially when it comes to issues relating to kids.
So as a foundational matter, so we already have a question in the chat, and that's awesome. I'm going to go over some foundation because I think it might lend itself directly to answering that question. In March of 2020, when all hell broke loose and we all went to distance learning, the United States Department of Ed came out and directly said that there is no inherent privacy right in a student's home learning environment, that it is going to be treated under FERPA. FERPA's Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It's a federal law that governs the privacy of student records. But for purposes of FERPA, a home virtual classroom is the same as a brick and mortar classroom. And that's a good analogy to keep bringing ourselves back to. Whatever rights you have in the classroom are usually going to be the same privacy rights you're going to have in your home. And one example they brought up was, just as you can have parents volunteering in the classroom, it doesn't violate a student's privacy right if other people have siblings or parents in the background. That's not necessarily violating the privacy of other children who might be in an online learning environment. So that was specifically from the United States Department of Ed. The next part I want to talk about a little bit is recording, and can a district record? And the long and short of it is that there is a California Penal Code section, criminal, that you can't eavesdrop on somebody. You can't record somebody without telling them about it. But you can, as long as you give notice, record this online instruction. And, with students who are absent, or, they might not be able to participate during the day for whatever reason, it could be, for practical reasons, a really good thing to have these lessons recorded so they can be replayed at a later time. But there's a new law that came out, Senate Bill 820, which really expressly said that these online lessons can be recorded by school districts. So that really clarified a little bit of question. But that's a lot of, I know that with a lot of school site administrators, they get questions from parents saying, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with you recording our lessons. Well, they're not being pushed out publicly. They're just being maintained by the district to be shared with other students who might be absent, or to be kept as a district record. That doesn't mean your school district is putting them up on the internet or anything like that. The flip side to that is, can parents and students record? And Lisa, I'd love to hear your opinion on this too, but we have recommended to school districts that when they put out a notice about online instruction, you put out a notice about expectations or recommendations, how to set up the environment for distance learning, we recommend two legal components. One, a notice that they may be recorded by the district, and two, a prohibition that a student or parent not record them and not reshare them or repost them. And same with your staff. If you have a district staff also should not be posting these publicly. Your online instruction may include student records and educational records, which are private information, and they should not be posted on the internet or social media or anything like that. I know some teachers try to be creative and might want to resell their lesson plans, but I definitely think we should discourage parents and students from recording and reposting. The only maybe exception to this would be is if it's directly written into a special education student's IEP, their individualized education plan. But even then, usually the district offers to make a recording and make it available to them versus the parent or the advocate or the student doing the recording themselves. Lisa, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 points. One is with Senate Bill 820, what that was intending to do was clarify a bunch of confusion around an ed code provision, 51512, which says explicitly that you can't record in a classroom without the teacher and the principal's consent. And it clarified that districts, as Gretchen said, can. But again, much of the conversations a lot at the bargaining table are around not necessarily the teacher themselves recording or potentially the district, unless it's used for evaluative or other kinds of disciplinary purposes. But the parents and students either capturing it through their phones or other kinds of recording devices and misusing images, particularly of teachers on the internet, taking their heads and posting them in compromising positions and other things. So it's not just a policy issue. It is actually prohibited from other people from recording without consent. But one of the things you're going to have to work carefully with your district office people as well and your HR staff is what, if anything, has migrated into any of your collective bargaining agreement or MOU language around recording, whether that's that the district has already promised that it won't, early on, there were a number of districts that made promises that they wouldn't be recording lessons or requiring recording of lessons during distance learning. So whether or not 820 says that the district can, it may have already made agreements saying you can't. So as a site administrator, I would say you'd want to be very careful and make sure that you aren't, you know, expressing requirements of your teaching staff around recording lessons and other things without checking in with the district office and those kinds of agreements that might be in place.
That's a great reminder, Lisa. Thank you.
Because that's what's happening. There was so much fear and anxiety going into distance learning, not only in the spring, but even through the summer, because once we had SB 98 and the rules changed with regard to distance learning and what the requirements were going to be about synchronous instruction requirements, as well as, you know, minimum daily minutes, the anxiety level ratcheted up, which I'm sure all of you felt very directly. You know, suspension on evaluations wasn't necessarily going to be there for everyone. So recording, watching, being able to see and do and capture missteps that teachers might make because they're uncomfortable with technology, whether it's kids doing bad things on camera, whether it's inadvertently something happening behind them while the teacher's doing instruction, all those kinds of things. You'd be surprised what's migrated into these MOUs, and so you do need to be careful.
One of the questions in the chat, which is, what about a parent taking a quick snap of a photo? And I think that's exactly what Lisa was just talking about, how many teachers were concerned that their image would be misused. I mean, and students would make a meme out of it, and they'd be the punchline of a joke. And so we do, I believe we provided Laura's sample language for district administration to implement guidelines for school districts that says both a prohibition against photos and recording of online instruction. I get it, students are sneaky. It would be hard to police all of that, but at least putting it out there that that's a prohibition and is something that we recommend, because I mean, it could be used easily for bullying or another student or a teacher.
It actually is criminal liability for this, which is something that's put into the acceptable use policies, as well as those notices to parents and students that are signed off on in the front end of the school year when everybody's getting their technology and signing in and getting their, you know, their passwords to their Zoom classrooms. So, you know, some people that doesn't matter, other people it will, just that gentle reminder.
You know, and we had another question here in the chat, and it is, the question is, what about a counseling services meeting with students privately on Zoom? Do parents have to be notified? I have not come across this very specific question, but I would draw the analogy back to, well, what happens on a school site? Does a student meet privately with the school counselor? Do you have to give parents advance notice that they're coming to the counselor's office? I don't think so. Certainly with counselors, if there is, there are certain triggers if a student's going to harm themselves or harm somebody else where you have to report out, but I wouldn't think that there is an obligation to notify parents in advance of a student counselor meeting. Lisa, do you have any exceptions?
I'm not aware of anything specific. I would say that, you know, the older the child is, especially once you get upwards of high school, you know, the chances of parent notifications regarding, you know, those one-on-one meetings is going to drop down drastically, especially the reasons why counselors might be meeting with students. The issues around, you know, these kinds of virtual meetings with counselors, or whether it's with related service providers and special education, you know, a lot of those things are happening one-on-one. They are not in group settings. So you're going to be looking to your district-wide policy and services folks around what are the expectations around those one-on-one meetings. I know that there are oftentimes some concerns that staff raise, you know, about, you know, one-on-one situations virtually, and, you know, whether or not, you know, it may set them up in situations which they may be uncomfortable in, you know, questions about recording, you know, whether those sessions are actually confidential. It's a lot easier to maintain confidentiality in a room, you know, in your office and on a school site. Right here, you don't know who's like actually on the other side of my screen. So, and some of those concerns have been raised around virtual classrooms, as well as virtual, you know, it's not therapy, but counseling sessions and other things. So you're going to want to walk through your folks around what are their Zoom meeting, you know, expectations, what are the commitments in terms of participation, so that you're not necessarily inadvertently violating confidentiality with third parties able to look in. That gets to the Zoom bombing thing, which is, I know, probably one of the things that Gretchen will deal with, which she'll address on our laundry list of things. Just last week, we had a bargaining session where we were all extremely high level Zoom users, and we had an extremely sophisticated Zoom bomber who we could not block out of the room. No matter what we were doing, we had to basically log out everybody, create a whole new room to get back in and start bargaining. And so those kinds of things are real. And, you know, if you're not watching carefully, sometimes you can miss, you know, those folks who are lurking in the background. And, you know, we don't want to compromise confidentiality with, you know, not paying attention to some of those protocols. I know that kind of meandered in a little bit of different areas, but all this stuff is so like
Intertwined.
It's all intertwined.
Yeah, I have another sort of related issue to recording and making this information public, and why it's probably not, why you shouldn't, that I just want to mention to our school site administrators, because it's important their staff understands this as well. When you do the back to school packet that Lisa mentioned, there is the opportunity for families to opt out of having student directory information shared. And directory information is usually a student's image, their name, any standard information about them. Parents can sign a form saying, I don't want that shared publicly. So it might be, it's not going to be in the school yearbook, or it's not going to be on the school website. The reason why parents opt out, they don't have to give a reason, but often it could be because domestic violence in the home. There may be a non-custodial parent that you are trying to keep their location and identity confidential. And so that's all the more reason why it's really important that your school site knows which of your students have opted out of having their directory information posted publicly, and that your teachers are aware of which students have opted out, because you really would be set up like in a liability situation if one of your teachers was to post some information on the internet or on social media about their class and have a student be located or identified. It really happens. I mean, in our community, we had a non-custodial parents on the internet where their student was going to school. This was before COVID. They pulled up after school to pick up their son, who they just got out of jail, pick up their son from school, and drove him over the border to Mexico for 3 years until he was brought back. So sadly, there's a lot of kids who are in not so great situations at home. And so that's all the more reason, if you have parents that opt out, you need to have a protocol in place and make sure your teachers really respect that.
I want to jump in on that, because there's two parts to this, and I know a lot of people kind of mush them together. There's directory information under your policies, and there's also the media release and the use of images. And I think more, as opposed to directory, we're talking about the use of images of students and names on that media type release thing, and whether parents opt out to have their children's images and names used in that setting. Because under the district's directory information policy, it isn't just anybody can know anything about the name and their face and other things. It actually says in the policy who is entitled to that directory information, and it's not anyone and their brother. And in the land of virtual classrooms, as you can see right now on your screen, Gretchen has her name actually under her picture. I have my name. Laura's name is right there. Josh has his disembodied name with the ACSA logo. But if somebody were to be able to be taking pictures or in the background or access these Zoom classrooms, these virtual classrooms, they would actually get a roadmap with faces as well as names attached to those faces, because most teachers and districts are creating expectations and protocols for classes that kids can't change their names. They have to be their actual names on screen. And so you do want to be very careful. That's where the recording piece comes into play, because it explodes the amount of information that is out there on children, and the domestic abuse and those custody orders and other kinds of things are very real. And the vulnerability that this puts some children in is that position is, you know, if being basically kidnapped by your parent and taken to Mexico for 3 years isn't, you know, a stark reality of what can happen, it's just imperative that we're very careful about those kinds of things.
Can I ask a question real quickly? This actually has been asked of you, but the question is, what do we do if students turn the camera on and are dressing or are shirtless? But of course, that could lead to many, many more scenarios than just that one question. So really the question is, what do you do if a student is doing something that they shouldn't be doing and it's on camera?
So it's a great question, and is a good segue to our kind of second privacy topic, which is cameras in the home, and what do you do about students who want to opt, either doing something inappropriately or they're turning their camera off and not participating. So first I would say to school site administrators, always analogize it to what would happen in a standard brick and mortar classroom. Your code of conduct still applies regardless if you're in a virtual classroom or if you're in the classroom. And if you wouldn't allow students to take off their shirts or start dressing in the middle of class, then they shouldn't be doing it in their camera. And that might be a scenario where the teacher has to either turn the student's camera off because it's inappropriate for everybody else to see it, or you pull them aside separately. Maybe it was inadvertent and they didn't realize their camera was on. So it's catching things on camera is going to happen, and absolutely there should be a protocol for how we handle it. But I'd like to tie that into the other concept of, we received a ton of questions. Do we have to allow our students to turn their cameras off? There's been a lot of demands from parents saying, we are not going to allow our students to have their camera on. So I will say in the spring, there was much more flexibility from school districts to allow students to opt out of online instruction or opt out of having their camera on. In the fall, there's now been a law passed that basically says daily live interaction is required. There's a lot more burden on a school district and on teachers to make sure they are engaging with these students. They don't have to allow students to, you do not have to affirmatively come out and say, if a student wants to turn their camera off, they have that right. If there's no affirmative right to do that, but there are reasons why a student may be turning their camera off that isn't necessarily grounds for discipline. It's more grounds for a follow-up discussion and see what's going on with that student. So some examples might be, they may be a homeless student, they may be ashamed, they may be being bullied. The other one is that they simply don't have the connectivity in their home, in which case the district, if it's bullying, you have a duty to intervene and stop bullying from happening. If it's connectivity, the district kind of has a duty to help them get a wireless hotspot. And so, you may want to have a protocol. Another reason could be if it's written into maybe a student's IEP plan or something that they don't use a camera. So short of proceeding straight to discipline, we encourage school site administrators or districts to have a protocol in place of, okay, if a student isn't turning on their camera, first reach out to the student, maybe reach out in the chat, see what the problem is and if it can be resolved. If it is simply, you have a bunch of high schoolers and think it's funny for all of them to turn off the camera, or they're belligerent, or I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying you can't discipline students, but there's several interventions you could take first. And the one thing we've been telling school districts is be very careful that this isn't, that ultimately it's not going to be disproportionately discriminatory against any certain protected class of students. So be very uniform and consistent on how you implement discipline and have a protocol of when you would arrive at that decision so that it is applied consistently across the board. And I'm sure Lisa has a lot to say on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, it dovetails into issues of equity as well. I think Gretchen hit two very big ones that have come up a number of times around homeless students, as well as students who may be in multifamily living arrangements and other things where they may have some level of embarrassment or other kinds of shame associated with, what's going on in the background. And, I'm assuming everybody on this call or this webinar knows, but that as far as I'm aware, we still don't have backgrounds available in Google Meets, as far as virtual backgrounds like the one that Gretchen has operating right now, and that the virtual backgrounds do not work when you are operating Zoom over a Chromebook. So you will see what's going on in the background, and most of the districts that I'm working with do have folks in place who are doing outreach and working with families where there are those kinds of access issues or other kinds of things where students may feel extremely uncomfortable being on camera. It goes to the policy also of having your face on camera. I'm staring at my face all day long every day on interminable Zooms. And one of the studies that's coming up is also around the effects, especially with girls, of staring at their face constantly and self-esteem issues. I think that's going to maybe go into some of the social emotional learning topic that you have for another day, but there are so many ramifications of this, and having a policy where kids have to be on camera it seems to be the recommended best practices, at least in my experience, and that if there are barriers or issues, dealing with those on a case-by-case basis is going to be the most effective way of dealing with it, and the most appropriate, because we are still under the restrictions under law for disciplining students for defiance and excluding them from school, so you do need to be careful. I will put in a little PSA spot in here for you guys as site leaders. It is a critical importance, not only in this context, but others will be talking about, that you are in lockstep with your fellow site administrators in your district around how you are approaching these kinds of topics, because it can quickly become an equity issue. Particularly with defiance, and if you guys are moving away from distance learning into a hybrid model, or you're already in-person instruction and you're dealing with things like failure for students to adhere to PPE, face mask, social distancing requirements, and some principals are dealing with it, in one way, others are taking a very hard line on moving to, disciplinary consequences fast. Depending how things go, you can start seeing trends, and they can have discriminatory impacts that you were not necessarily aware of, and an inconsistency district-wide, which is going to make your teachers mad and your unions mad, because site to site, you're not going to have consistency. And in this land of safety, where we're not only talking about safety from actually contracting COVID, but in privacy land, we're talking about safety in your personal information, medical information, and other things. Being consistent is going to be, essentially critical to keep the district and yourselves, out of disputes, out of lawsuits, out of claims.
Speaking of privacy measures, one I want to mention, it's a little bit of a pivot here, but distance learning, online instruction, everybody was scrambling to get this up and running. And in some districts, teachers were uploading their own software programs, they were downloading their own apps, they were looking for resources. And I applaud anybody for being a teacher right now and being innovative and doing what they need to do. But as a data privacy law attorney, there absolutely needs to be a process in place for approval and vetting of that software and those apps. There are a myriad of laws restricting what data software companies can collect from students. And there's actually like a 10-point list of requirements that need to be in their terms and conditions before a school district can ever allow. Start familiar with those 10 requirements and wouldn't know to make sure that this is a safe. And really where this gets tricky is that they may be free resources, free apps, free software, and the teacher doesn't see any harm. There's usually two reasons why it's free. It's either a pilot program for 3 months and then the fees kick in and the district hasn't budgeted for it. They don't have authority, the teacher doesn't have authority to commit the district to pay for this. The other part is if it's free, the software company has to be making money somewhere. And it is not unusual at all that they make money by collecting the students' data and turning around and selling it, which is illegal in California, but it's not illegal in other states. So the software companies sometimes will do that in order to be profitable. They also will do what's called targeted advertising. They collect the students' information, they learn that they really like unicorns, and now they send them advertisements all about unicorns. That's targeted advertising. And that's also prohibited in the state of California, but it might not be nationwide. So we just don't want any teachers to step in it inadvertently. It's all the more reason why there should be a process in place. And I know that earlier Laura sent a link to some of our law firm's resources, but I just want to mention one that might be a helpful resource for all of you on this. We put together a really short 5-minute video that you can share with your staff if you want, and it's called Ask Before You App. And the whole intent there is to help them understand when there's red flags on software and apps, educational software and apps, and when they should have a protocol in place or how to vet these softwares and apps, and when they should ask the question from their site administrator or maybe your technology department at the district office level. And while I'm mentioning 5-minute videos and plugs, there's another one that we have that might also, it's the same location that Laura hosted. It's also, we have another short video called Pause Before You Post, and it is intended to be shared in the school community. It is free, and we are lawyers saying, help us help you. Be careful about what you post, because as you all know, and we can talk about this in a minute, there's lots of nasty opinions out there on social media, and it can really get people into some hot water. And so we can turn to that in a minute. But Laura, did you have a comment?
No, that to ask questions in the chat box. So please, feel free to ask questions, and we'll try to answer.
The other point about that, just to dovetail on what Gretchen said, is that you're going to want to be careful. A number of the labor agreements out there related to not only distance learning, but also the hybrid, when you're doing any kind of online or virtual instruction, there may be educational frameworks or other express language in those MOUs which dictates the specific platforms that are approved, or also provide an internal process in order to get new apps or other kinds of platforms approved. Some districts are far more wide open about letting teachers figure out how they're going to do, whether they're going to use Google Meets, Google Hangouts, whether they're going to use Seesaw, depending on the age range, or whether they're in Zoom. So you do need to make sure before you are talking to your staff that you coordinate with Ed Services and HR to make sure that there aren't any agreements out there for consistency that you don't want, that you're not inadvertently tripping up and stumbling over some of those things by telling teachers, yeah, go ahead and use Seesaw. That looks great for kindergarten or first grade, but when Seesaw hasn't been approved by your district. So you do need to be careful with those things. And it goes to ask before you app, or ask, pause before you post. Same thing. There's a lot of, Easter eggs and nuggets that are hidden, that are in these labor agreements that you would not necessarily think are in there, but it's worth asking.
So I know we don't have a ton of time left, so I want to just hit a few more topics. One is Zoom bombing, as Lisa mentioned. We also want to talk a little bit about mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect, and medical confidentiality. So, Zoom bombing, Lisa, I would love to get your big on this, but I feel like it comes down to school districts and school sites providing very clear guidance to staff on how to respect the settings and what to do, even if you put those settings in place and there is a breach, how to respond, whether you turn that person's camera off, whether you discontinue the class. And so it's really helpful to have teachers trained on, one, how to prevent it, and two, how to respond if it happens. Do you have anything? And we do have, I will tell you that
Gretchen, you froze up.
Zoom itself, if that's your platform, for teachers on how they should orchestrate their settings to create a safe environment.
Yeah, I think, the key is just to make sure your teachers are comfortable with, what are their security options and how are they going to react. I mean, I think you need to come at this with everybody needs to assume that they're going to get bombed, Zoom bombed or Google bombed or whatever the heck bombing is going to happen, is that it will happen. And so what do you do when it does? And so that it's not everybody's a deer in the headlights when it happens and not know how to deal with it, because it can be the goofy, kids in high school or middle school who are Zoom bombing you and they're relatively easy to deal with, or it could be the extremely sophisticated hacker who hit my son's high school actually last week, which was popping in and out using student names through the Canvas portal with protected login information. So, don't underestimate it. Just have your teachers make sure that they all know, what's the plan and the protocol. Don't worry about it. Just follow the protocol on how you're going to do it methodically and make sure that what happens. I know Gretchen mentioned it, and just before make sure we have enough time, there was one thing I did want to make sure we were also talked about, because this is the thing that's coming up for me a lot, is around positive COVID information. And I know it seems a little bit of a left turn here, but I just wanted to say that I feel your pain, particularly as site administrators, and having everybody ask you who it was. I want to know who. Give me the name. Can you give me a nod and a wink or whatever? Blink twice if I'm right. Any of those kinds of things. The pressure is immense. The anxiety and fear around COVID is real. Whether you believe in it like the tooth fairy or not, I don't know what to say about that in this particular landscape, but the reality is that everybody wants to know everybody's business, and we have a lack of social connections in person, and so people are thirsty for connections and information and trying to protect themselves. All I can say is that you have to absolutely have a stone face, and you cannot inadvertently, through body language or other kinds of things, disclose anything around positive cases. It's going to be even more difficult once you're in on-site instruction and you're doing health screenings, whether you engage in active screening or whether you engage in passive screening, and who's being sent home and who's in quarantine. Some of the information is going to become obvious, and that's not something you can help. There are parents who are going to blab on and on about, Johnny, and that's not your problem, but you can't validate it. It's the same as discipline in the brick and mortar setting. Everybody in the quote unquote may know who it is, but that doesn't mean you can say it. Same thing goes with COVID tests and positive cases.
I think that's a really important reminder for teachers. Oh, sorry, I froze up, so I apologize. Can you hear me okay?
She's got like 5 different people in her household working on the same Wi-Fi, so.
That connectivity. I just want to say that it's important for teachers to know that as well. In my community, teachers are also your neighbors, and they gossip, and it's someone's medical confidentiality is vital. So what typically happens, in my experience, is what a school site administrator might say when they receive these questions is, we have to respect the privacy, this person, the person's individual privacy. However, we can reassure you that it's been reported to the county, and the county may contact people who've been exposed, or here's all the health and safety measures we are taking. So you can reassure them that, if their student has been exposed, that they will be contacted, or whatever your local county protocol is. But you may want to have that statement sort of prepared and just stick to it. Because as Lisa said, people will call and say, are you guys okay? Can you hear me?
You were just freezing up a little bit, Gretchen.
I'm so sorry. Anyway, I think I got my point across though.
Yeah, and you know what? The one other thing out there, it isn't just parents that are going to be demanding to know who tested positive and why the class or the school or anything was shut down. This is actually coming up really significantly within employee groups, and wanting to know who and what and why and where and everything else. And these are terms that are also in the labor agreements out there about who's getting notice and what kind of notice is being provided. The pressure, there's already a high anxiety for people working on sites. And so to the extent that there is a notification to one side of about a positive case, people are going to want to know who it is or where it was, because they're going to want to know and be able to figure out if they walked through that room or were in that building or something for some period of time. And so you're going to need to be able to make sure you work closely with HR, as well as following what the union the protocols in terms of notification to the unions. There's employment law out there with Cal OSHA as well as EEOC regarding mandatory notifications for people who were known to or identified to have had contact with infected individuals. So a script around, if in fact we have strict protocols in terms of knowing who's on campus when and who was where. We have notified all those individuals with known contact with the individual who has self-identified as having a positive COVID case. That's all I can tell you. I mean, at the end of the day, that's their personal information. COVID shaming is a real thing. And so we need to be very careful. These things can also play out along, equity lines and racial lines. And so we need to be hyper aware of how these kinds of things can morph in unexpected ways. And consistency and maintaining that kind of information, as strictly confidential is even more important now than it ever has been.
Just as an FYI, in most communities, in most counties, they define as an exposure
being within 6 feet of somebody.
As being within 6 feet for more than tricky, where someone's going to say, well, my student's in the same classroom, but if they don't sit within 6 feet, they may not be designated as someone who's technically exposed and get that notice from the county. But you all aren't medical experts. In fact, neither are we. That's why you defer to the county, who has an obligation to contact people who will be exposed. What's the district's obligation? To provide a safe school environment and to make sure that people are notified who need to be notified. You're doing your sanitation protocol, you're complying with county health order, safe environment. Speaking of which, I really want to mention before we go, or my phone or my camera, how important it is to remind your staff about their obligations as mandatory reporters of abuse and neglect. Now that we have a camera directly into the homes, and it's a very stressful time financially for people, or you're working at home with 3 kids who are online at the same time. It's a stressful environment, and teachers are mandatory reporters of abuse and neglect regardless of where they see it. So if they see something in the home or on camera that leads them to reasonably suspect a student is being abused or neglected, they have an individual responsibility to report that to Child Protective Services or to law enforcement. And it's a great, easy reminder for your staff that could come into play here.
And that's one of the reasons why generally we don't want to or not have children be able to turn off cameras, or have parents require cameras being off. Sometimes these are the only ways that we're going to be able to put eyeballs on kids and make sure that they're safe. I'm sure you guys aren't immune to the information and data out there about the unbelievably precipitous drop-off of abuse and, essentially CPS calls and reports on abused children when we went into shelter in place. And there's no coincidence there, is that the kids are no longer out and about. They are no longer in schools where trusted adults who have obligations under CANRA to make those kinds of reports can see them. And so there are a lot of kids at risk, and we want to be sure that we're doing our jobs and keeping kids safe and making those reports, and that they aren't isolated and at risk in a virtual setting, in a virtual classroom setting.
That's Laura, that's all the I think you're on mute, but those were mostly the key points we wanted to cover. And I know we're almost out of time. Is there any closing comments or closing questions that you all have?
Well, I think there's one question that I'm actually quite curious about too, is it was mentioned that oftentimes there's a lag time between county notifying the students or the teachers about exposure. So what do the site do? Do they send the kids home in the meantime? Everybody close the school? I mean, really, what are their options at that point?
I would work with your district administration and the county for guidance, because I don't think that the district should step in the shoes of the county and start doing notifications and contact tracing for them. But if there's concern about a safe environment, most schools are set up that if they have in-person instruction, they can easily transition to distance learning if there is an actual outbreak or a suspected outbreak. So, I mean, if there's a genuine concern that there's multiple students that have either tested positive or come into contact, I think you would work with your district administration to temporarily transition to distance learning, online instruction, until you can coordinate more directly with the county.
I just would like to add in, I think it was updated on August 5th, if I'm not mistaken, but the CDPH has guidance for schools, particularly with regard to when things around notifications, contact tracing, when classrooms, full schools, all those other things get closed because of positive cases. So there is actually CDPH guidance that, that districts are following. If your local county public health department has more restrictive guidelines, those will be published, and those are usually pushed out through your county office of education, or on those general superintendent's calls that they're having. I don't know whether they're still doing them weekly now with the local public health officers, but they do have very specific protocols in place with regard to notifications. If you get a positive case, it's pretty easy to do the actual classroom notifications. It's really more of, as you sort of keep moving, wider in the circles in the contact tracing realm, and that's really a public health function, not an educational institution function. So, if you have questions about what those are, I think, you can look to the CDPH guidance. It's on the website, and the COVID-19 section on CDPH, specifically one of the clicks on schools. We're looking at that. There's, most of those answers can be found right there. The reality is if you don't know, you can't notify somebody. So if you don't know that somebody had a close contact, as that's defined by CDPH guidance and the CDC, which is that, inside 6 feet for more than 15 minutes, then there is no notification obligation. And most of the districts that I'm aware of are not going and expanding beyond the public health guidelines in terms of notifications, other than to just do generalized, keep your community aware of, we had one here or there or whatever, because once you start notifying people, then that puts pressure on the testing centers and on the public health resources. So there's a balancing here, which you do need to be in lockstep in your principals meetings with HR, as well as your ed services folks.
And we are about at an hour, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you, both Gretchen and Lisa, for your time and your great wealth of knowledge that you provided to everybody. We are going to be having a series of webinars, as we mentioned before. Stay tuned. We'll be pushing it out. We don't have another date set yet for the next one. And also, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you have any types of issues that you really need assistance with, that we can help you through a webinar. If it's a big topic, please let us know. We want to be able to serve you and help you navigate this trying time. Be well, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks everybody at ACSA. Bye-bye.